a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. I've been on a coffee break since April of 2015. All day, every day, I can sit back and enjoy a few cups right after I take care of the cats, the dogs, pick up trash in the yard, clean the kitchen. Well, I drink coffee just about any time I get to sit down. I drink only the best coffee I can find. Organic Man Coffee Trike 4501 McPherson has the best coffee in the universe. If you can't get there from there, wherever there is, go to organicmancoffeetrike.shop. What could possibly go wrong? You enjoy the day? David Subith sent me a note asking if I ever looked into George Mallory and the controversy surrounding him. I looked into my notes and I saw there was nothing about his life or death. I guess I could maybe do a 30-minute show on the guy, and then I could round it out by talking about Sir Edmund Hillery. As I did the research, I discovered that George had done enough to fill a show, maybe an hour and a half. I had to do a lot of trimming to get the show down to just 1 hour. I do a lot of crazy things, but there are a lot of things I won't do. I do not go exploring caves. Too many folks have crawled into the great unknown below our feet only to never come back. I don't climb mountains either. There are over 300 dead folks sitting on the side of Mount Everest right now. People who thought they could make it. Their last words may have been, "What can possibly go wrong?" I also don't go swimming with sharks. I don't play with tigers. I don't try to pet snakes. There's a lot of other things I just won't do because I don't really like pain. The folks who say, let's go climb that mountain over there because, well, it's there, are just beyond me. I don't have an inkling to be the first at anything. George Herbert Lee Mallory was born at Newton Hall, Moberly, Cheshire, on June 18, 1886. He was the second child to Reverend Herbert Lee Mallory and Anne Bridget Lee Mallory. George started climbing things at around age 7 when he managed to get to the top of the church at St. Wilfrid's. His sisters said he was really into climbing, seeing what all he could get on top of any time he had the chance. In 1896, Mallory was sent to Glens Gorse boarding school in Eastbourne on the south coast of England. It was the thing back then for kids to be sent away for their education, especially if their families had money or status. The school was suddenly shut down when the headmaster died unexpectedly. Mallory won a math scholarship to Winchester College at around 1900. He was good at sports, becoming their best gymnast. He also excelled at marksmanship. The housemaster, which I guess that's the guy in charge of housing, of the college, R. Irving, was an accomplished mountaineer and a member of the Alpine Club. Irving was searching for new climbing companions after the death in an accident of the partner with whom he had done most of his climbing. Okay, the guy he was climbing mountains with falls to his death, so he just looks for a replacement. Irving recruited Mallory and Harry Gibson. In early August 1904, Irving, Mallory, and Gibson traveled to the Alps for Mallory's first high altitude mountaineering. Having a math scholarship, George began looking into history. He got so wrapped up in it that he was awarded another scholarship, this time in history, at the Magdalen College in Cambridge. Some say that George was attracted to other guys. Some say other guys were attracted to him. I don't know. I wasn't there. Some folks did hang around the same sex while away from home. It was a chancy thing to do because it was against the law at the time. You could wind up in prison for such activity. What they chose to do together is none of our business. Let's just say they had a gay old time. He did eventually marry a woman. It is nothing to me whether this is true or not. Some people say all kinds of things about others when they're no longer around to defend themselves. George joined the University Fabian Society, a British socialist organization whose purpose was to advance the principles of social democracy and democratic socialism via gradualist and reformist efforts in democracy. There are two terms that don't go together: socialism and democracy. It's better known as mob rule. George also acted as the college secretary on the university's Women's Suffrage Association committee. I did a little side investigation because of the petition that was being circulated just a few years ago. A bunch of highly educated students were passing around a petition to end women's suffrage. They got a lot of signatures from fellow highly educated students until somebody explained what suffrage was. Suffrage is the right to vote in public political elections and referendums. Apparently, they stopped teaching civics to make it easier to control people. If you don't know what your rights are, how do you know when they're being stepped on? The side investigation took me down another trail. What I didn't expect was how many times this same petition was brought up. It is still going on today in some places. Before you sign anything, you might want to know what the heck it is, unless you're in Congress. In February 1909, Geoffrey Winthrop Young invited George to Wales for a climbing trip around Easter. After the climb, Young sent him an application form for the Climbers Club. May 1909, Mallory was elected a member. I've heard of the Explorers Club, but never the Climbing Club. I've done rappelling in the past. We jumped off buildings and out of helicopters. It's really fun once you get over that initial few seconds of panic. It was always tactical stuff. We got to see a lot of how not to do things whenever our teammates screwed up. I didn't screw up too much, a few times. In July 1910, at age 24, George began teaching at the English public school. He taught Latin, mathematics, history, and French. His students were typical boys. They found his teaching style to be very undisciplined. In that time, you sat in your desk and you spoke only when spoken to. Once the kids found out he didn't stop them, they kind of took over the class. This never works. Teachers that strive to be the students' pals usually wind up being ignored or laughed at. The parents of his students often mistook him for one of the students. His teaching methods were geared to trying to get the students interested in the subject, even when the kids were more interested in playing sports. Several colleagues developed a hostile attitude towards him due to his informal teaching methods, which they considered undermining discipline. He recommended students read literature and write essays instead of kicking a ball around the field. Mallory embarked on 8 expeditions in the Alps and achieved 4 first ascents. His first climb was August 5th, 1904, when he, Irving, and Gibson ascended Mount Velan on the Swiss-Italian border. Before getting to the top, they were forced to turn back when Mallory and Gibson both began suffering from altitude sickness. The pressure of air that surrounds you is called barometric or atmospheric pressure. When you go too high in altitude, this pressure drops and there is less oxygen available. Your brain stops functioning correctly. Talk about Rocky Mountain High. If you live in a place that's located at a moderately high altitude, you get used to the air pressure. But if you travel to a place at a higher altitude than you're used to, your body needs time to adjust to the change in pressure. Anytime you go above 8,000 feet, you can be at risk of altitude sickness. Your body realizes there's a lack of oxygen and it produces more red blood cells to compensate. Funny thing is, it takes weeks, sometimes months, to adjust to the higher altitude, but you lose the compensation within days of coming back down. On August 13th, they reached the summit of Dufourspitz, the third highest peak in Western Europe. August 26th, Irving and Mallory summited Mont Blanc at 15,800 feet, the highest mountain in Western Europe, marking Mallory's entry into high altitude mountaineering. That which doesn't kill you just might make you take bigger risks. January 1905, Graham Irving established the Winchester Ice Club. Mallory, Gibson, Harry Tyndale, and Guy Bullock. Glad I don't have his last name, Bullock. Sounds like you're full of it. Became members. In August, the Ice Club traveled to the Alps. George almost died after missing a hold above an overhang. Almost wasn't enough. He just kept climbing, figuring he's got this. Over the next several years, the Ice Club clomb every high mountain they could get to. I see it as a bit of a waste. They nearly kill themselves climbing to tiny little rock formations, gasping for breath, getting to the very top to take a few photos and then head back down where it's warm and you don't have to worry about falling off any cliffs or dying from a lack of oxygen. September 18th, 1907, George, Keynes, and Wilson were trying a new route in Wales when they dislodged a huge boulder that nearly killed 2 of the 3. George was not one of them. Instead of calling it quits, they just named the trail the Avalanche Route and kept going. Most of George Mallory's biography is a list of all the mountains he clomb and all the tiny little details that only another mountain climber might find interesting. But I don't. George did a lot of climbing in a lot of places all over Europe. As I said earlier, George did eventually get married. Christina Ruth Turner was a daughter of an architect, Hugh Thackeray Turner, and Mary Elizabeth Turner. George and the Turner family developed a close friendship, and he would regularly visit their home. Home? That's not the right name for it. Complex? Mansion complex? That might do. In Westbrook. In April 1914, Mallory joined Thackeray and his daughters on a holiday in Venice, where Mallory and Ruth fell in love. May 1st, 1914, George and Ruth became engaged. Thackeray purchased a six-bedroom house for them, named The Halt, in Godalming, Surrey. My mother-in-law bought us a dining room set. Close enough. Days before the outbreak of the Great War, the war to end all wars, George and Ruth were hitched. His dad performed the ceremony. George enlisted in the Army and began artillery training in Weymouth Camp in January of 1916. Frank Fletcher, the headmaster at the Charter House, challenged George's inquiries about enlisting, asking the government about their policies regarding schoolmasters enlisting. I wonder if there was some ulterior reason for the challenge. Perhaps Frank was afraid everybody would look down on him for not going. The thing about the old style military, folks who could read and write were automatically turned into officers. Folks with the right family connections were placed higher up in the ranks because, well, they were gentlemen. George Mallory was assigned as an orderly officer, serving as a colonel's assistant at the 30th Heree Artillery Group headquarters, 3 miles behind the front lines. February 1917, the command recommended Mallory for a staff position. He rejected it and was instead assigned a liaison officer position to the French unit. At the end of March, he applied and rejoined the 40th Siege Battery, which had moved to a new location. April 7th, during the prelude to the Battle of Arras, Mallory was back at the front, and the 40th Siege Battery in an exposed observation post, directly in the line of fire from the enemy. All that mountain climbing, all those close calls, all those near-death experiences led to him wanting more than to be in the rear with the gear. Mallory wrote home to his wife, saying, "The trenches were in a filthy state, owing to a more or less futile attack by our men the night before. I don't object to corpses so long as they're fresh. I still found that I could reason thus with them. But this is an accepted fact that men are killed. Your jaw hangs and your flesh changes color. Blood oozes from your wounds. With the wounded, it is different. That always distresses me to see them." He wrote that to his wife. The British High Command didn't allow the troops to fix up the trenches that they were living in. The idea being the trench was there to attack from. By keeping it in an undesirable state, men would be more inclined to go over the top and charge out across no man's land. The Germans fixed up their trenches. In fact, in their bathrooms, they had wallpaper. They were there to stay. In September, Mallory was sent to Avington Park Camp near Winchester, transferring from the Siege Battery to the Heavy Battery. George was trained to use, to show his men how to use the new 60-pound heavy guns. October 1917, Mallory was promoted to lieutenant and commenced training for newly promoted officers. By September 1918, Lieutenant Mallory was reassigned to the 515th Siege Battery stationed near Arras and the French coast. On the evening of November 11th, at the Officers' Club in Cambria, Mallory celebrated Armistice Day with his brother Trafford. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Due to the British Army needing to haul all their gear back home, Lieutenant Mallory did not return to England until January of 1919. At the end of January, Mallory resumed his teaching position at Charterhouse, where he taught English and history. He felt dissatisfied as a schoolmaster, devoting more attention to mountaineering and direction of international politics. He was also trying to find more time for writing. In January 1921, representatives of the Royal Geographical Society and the Alpine Club joined and established the Mount Everest Committee to organize and finance an expedition to Mount Everest. The committee consisted of 4 RGS members and 4 Alpine Club members. There were other countries trying to get a man to the top of the world. It was just wrong for anyone, not British, to be the first to summit Mount Everest. They did it for God and country, but mostly for country. The committee's primary objective in 1921 was a thorough reconnaissance of the mountain and its approaches to determine the most viable route to the summit, and in 1922 to return for a second expedition using this route that they had planned for an all-out attempt to reach the summit. On January 23, 1921, Mallory received written correspondence, that's a letter, from John Percy Farrar, secretary of the Alpine Club, its former president and now the Mount Everest Committee. In the letter, Farrar asked Mallory if he would be interested in participating in an expedition to Everest. Although grateful for the invitation, Mallory initially felt reluctant to accept it. He figured they weren't going to make it, and it was probably a waste of time. He also didn't want to be separated from his wife and child. When Mallory didn't jump to the chance, Geoffrey Winthrop Young visited him at Holt and managed to persuade him and Ruth not to disregard the opportunity, saying it would be an incredible adventure and it would earn him reputable renown for prospects in future professions as an educator and a writer. Young's argument convinced Ruth, and she concurred that Mallory should join the expedition. Was she trying to get rid of him? Figuring it was the opportunity of a lifetime, Mallory decided to participate. What could possibly go wrong? February 9th, 1921, Mallory met with Sir Francis Younghusband, that's his name, Younghusband, a chairman of the Mount Everest Committee, John Percy Farrar, committee member, and Harold Rayborn, the assigned mountaineering leader of the 1921 British Mount Everest reconnaissance expedition. At the meeting, Younghusband invited Mallory to join the expedition and was surprised when he didn't show any enthusiasm over the upcoming expedition. He was just kind of, yeah, okay, I'll go. Not really into it like everybody else. April 8th, 1921, Mallory departed from the port of Tilbury in Essex, England, on board the SS Sardinia, bringing the final load of supplies for the expedition. It was a solitary voyage because he was the only expedition member on the ship. He was the last one to head out. Really excited. The first Everest expedition, 1921, had the express objective of undertaking reconnaissance of the mountain and its approaches to discover the most accessible route to its summit. The team spent several months examining any and all routes that might get them to the top. They mostly stayed below 20,000 feet, avoiding the death zone, which is at 26,240 feet. Passing that height, you will encounter extreme cold, dangerously low oxygen levels, and extremely inhospitable conditions. Anyone venturing beyond that level is in the process of dying. The surprising thing to experts have found is most people who die are on their return hike. They made it to the top and they're now descending. From the western head of the Karta Glacier, they ascended to the Col of Lakpa La at 22,470 feet. A col is the lowest point of a ridge or a saddle between two peaks, typically affording a pass from one side of the mountain range to the other. Mount Everest stands at 29,032 feet above sea level. The mountain is growing about a quarter of an inch per year. 1953, Edmond Hillery and Tenzing Norgay managed to pull themselves up to the very top of the world. Since then, the top has grown 18 inches. Now, this might not sound like much until you're freezing to death, you can't breathe, and you got to go to the bathroom. The team had to find the best, safest way up and make sure that they were actually on Mount Everest. Up there in the death zone, you might get confused and climb the wrong peak. October 29th, Mallory departed Bombay, India on board the SS Malwa. Young husband wrote to Mallory asking him to say yes to a second expedition to be launched in 22. Mallory wanted to wait until the following year, but Youngblood said the Nepal government, young husband, sorry, not Youngblood, young husband said the Nepal government was in a friendly mood and they might not be so in 2 years. Mallory discussed the idea of trying to summit the mountain the following year with his wife. She was in favor of his going back as soon as possible. She's trying to get rid of him. I know my wife. If I asked her if I should climb a mountain any time in the future, she'd say, nah, it's too dangerous. With all the folks these two knew had died or been injured, I wonder what Mallory's wife was thinking. Did she have a huge life insurance policy on him? Amicable Society for the Perpetual Assurance Office was established in 1706. It was the first life insurance company in the world. An earlier form of life insurance dates back to ancient Rome, the Burial Club, which covered the costs of members' funeral expenses and assisted survivors financially. Mallory sent word to the Mount Everest Club committee, sorry, saying he was in. Got to get some more coffee in my system. Mallory returned to the Himalayas as a member of the 1922 British Everest expedition. The expedition's objective was to become the first to summit Everest. Why? Well, so the French, Germans, Norwegians, and Americans couldn't be the first. On March 2nd, Mallory, Howard Somerville, John Noel, Edward Stewart, George Finch, and Arthur Wakefield set out to conquer the top of the world. While en route, the team was taught how to use the oxygen equipment they were going to be using. Mallory didn't think they needed oxygen, but the others kind of convinced him it was a good idea. May 20th, Mallory, Somerville, Norton, Mooreshead, and four porters began their day at Camp 4 on the North Col at the elevation of 23,000 feet, and they commenced their ascent without oxygen. They hoped to climb the North Ridge and establish Camp 5 at 26,000 feet, just below the death zone. From there, they planned to try to reach the summit, and that's where they would start using their oxygen. Everything you use on a mountaineering trip, you have to carry. If you don't carry it, you don't have it when you get somewhere. So you can only carry so much oxygen, so you're careful when and where you use it. Once they reached 25,000 feet, Mallory did some calculations, and he said it was going to take 3 or 4 hours to make the next 1,000 feet. The Sherpas were not going to spend the night. They were heading back to Camp 4 to wait for the four mountain climbers to come back down. The team pitched camp 1,000 feet short of their intended goal. The next day at 8 a.m., the four mountaineers tied themselves together and headed on up. After only a few steps, Mooreshead, suffering from frostbite, said he was unable to continue, so he stayed behind at Camp 5. The adverse weather conditions had prevented the climbers from beginning at 6 a.m. as planned. So now they are 2 hours behind schedule and they're 1,000 feet below their intended goal. Their success was going to depend on time and speed. Mallory's calculations estimated their vertical ascent rate at 400 feet an hour, not including stops from which it was apparent they would be climbing into the nightfall, a risk that they were unwilling to take. The team set their retreat time at 2:30 p.m. If they weren't on top of the world by then, it was just too bad. When you go hiking, even on a nice day, you should never drink more than 50% of your water before turning back. Too many folks tried pushing themselves beyond the safe level only to find themselves in deep trouble. By 2:15, Mallory, Somerville, and Norton took a break by laying up against the North Ridge, where they remained for about 15 minutes. Their aneroid barometer read 26,800 feet, a new world's record, but it wasn't the top of the world. They began their descent at 4 p.m., reaching Camp 5, where Mooreshead was waiting to join them for the return to Camp 4. As they descended, Mooreshead, who was the third man on the rope, slipped, and he slid along, dragging Somerville and Norton down a slope leading directly to the East Rangabuk Glacier, several thousand feet below. Mallory, who was leading, immediately reacted by forcing a pick of his ice axe into the snow, hitching the rope around the axe, and then pushing down with it with all of his weight. He managed to save the lives of Somerville, Norton, and Mooreshead. They regained their positions and reached their tents after nightfall, exhausted, hungry, frostbitten, and dehydrated. None the wiser, they were planning. Try that again. None the wiser, they were playing with death with too many close calls. Well, it didn't kill me that time. What can possibly go wrong? May 27th, George Finch, Jeffrey Bruce, and Tejbir Burra departed Camp 6 at 25,500 feet on the North Ridge, using supplemental oxygen for another attempt. Burra handed off the extra oxygen and returned to Camp 4, while the two climbers continued on. Finch and Bruce loaded up the extra cylinders and they left their climbing rope behind to lessen their weight. Bruce, about 20 feet below Finch, discovered his oxygen regulator had failed. He had to struggle to catch up with Bruce, who managed to help pull his partner up to a safer location to see if they could fix his regulator. The device was too fouled with ice, so they had to turn back towards Camp 4. The pair had managed to reach 27,300 feet, which was just a little higher than Mallory's team. At the beginning of June, the expedition arranged a third attempt, because the last two hadn't killed anyone yet. The plan was to ascend to Camp 5 at 25,000 feet without using oxygen, and then use a cylinder each to continue to 26,000 feet, where they would make Camp 6. From there, the team would use the supplemental oxygen to attempt to reach the summit. June 7th, Mallory, Somerville, Crawford, and 14 porters left Camp 3 at 21,000 feet and traversed the head of East Rongbuk Glacier. There they set up Camp 4. They continued climbing throughout the day, but the porters, they headed back down because I don't think they were crazy. Let those crazy British men go up there and die. As they were moving, correction, I've gotten off on the wrong story. At 1:30, the group halted at 600 feet below Camp 5 to allow the porters to catch back up with them. As they were sitting there waiting, an avalanche began as an ice cliff above them plowed over the entire group. The expedition was scattered about the side of the mountain. The three British men were okay, but the Sherpas were in bad shape. The avalanche had dragged several of them off into a crevasse. 7 Sherpas were killed in that event. The Tibetan government authorized a third expedition to Everest on October 16, 1922. The Everest Committee resolved the third expedition would commence in the spring of 24. The committee set about raising money for all the world by giving lectures at universities. February 29th, Mallory and 3 other expedition members, Irvine, Beetham, and Hazard. How would you like to go climbing a mountain with a guy called Hazard? I wonder if he was a duke. Some of y'all will get that. They departed from Liverpool on board the SS California. I'll bet they weren't singing that song. Does that name sound familiar? Anyone who knows about the Titanic will recognize the name, but it's not that ship. The Titanic California was owned by J.P. Morgan. This was the ship that everybody accused of not going to the Titanic's aid until it was discovered that the Titanic was nowhere near where they said they were. The Titanic was also owned by J.P. Morgan. The California was in military service when on November 9th, 1915, it was torpedoed by a German U-boat U-34. Not wanting to come up with a new name, they simply named another ship the California. Welcome to the steamship California. No, that's not the song. June 1st at 6 a.m., Mallory and Jeffrey Bruce and 8 porters commenced their ascent from Camp 4 at 23,000 feet. They planned to climb the North Ridge and establish Camp 5 at 25,000 feet. They would spend the night and then move up to Camp 6 at 27,200 feet. The Sherpas lived at high elevation, so they were already acclimatized. The higher elevations didn't have the same effects on them, but they still sometimes just couldn't make it. They were constantly getting sick and having to be sent back down. The best laid plans of mice. You might need to read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe. No, Galaxy. Sorry, wrong book. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I was thinking of the best coffee in the universe. The best laid plans of mice. The Sherpas were carrying heavy loads so the British could conquer the mountain. This was how they made a living. But the idea of dying is always very real. As the team reached 25,000 feet, four of the porters were unable to continue. These men headed back to Camp 4 so they could survive. Mallory, Bruce, and the remaining porters began to climb. By Camp 6, the remaining porters became sick as well, and this led Mallory to cancel the summit plans and take everybody back down to where the oxygen was. June 4th, Mallory and Irvine headed up the mountain with visions of grandeur. They were going to make it this time, dang it. The trip up the mountain isn't 1 foot in front of the other until you arrive. A lot of time is spent going back and forth, dragging supplies up, leaving it in a safe place, and then going back down for more. They put in equipment caches all along the route so they didn't have to carry everything in one trip. It's not like unloading the truck after coming home from the groceries. It's more like going back and forth, bringing a little bit each trip. Both mountaineers shouldered modified oxygen apparatus, each carrying 2 cylinders, and their 8 porters, not using oxygen, brought up more provisions and more oxygen. They progressed steadily and attained Camp 5 in good time, and then the four of the porters returned to Camp 4. One porter brought down a note saying, "There's no wind up here and things look good." They figured they would be on top of the world the next day. The same day, expedition member Noel Odell and his porter, in support of Mallory and Irvine, clomb up to Camp 5. The porters were all sent back down, while Odell used a zoom lens on his camera and he tried to spot Mallory and Irvine. As he was scanning the area, fog rolled in, making his view impossible. The following morning, June 8th at 8 a.m., Odell moved up to Camp 6. He was greeted by clear skies and he began searching the side of Everest for the two mountaineers. Near the very top, he could just make out two black dots that were moving up the mountain. As he watched, more clouds moved in, stealing his view. The location of Odell's final sighting of Mallory and Irvine before they disappeared into the clouds was at the top of the second step and determined by expedition member John DeVars Hazard using a theodolite to be at an elevation of 28,230 feet. They were about 800 feet from the summit. At approximately 2 p.m., as Odell reached Camp 6, snow began to fall and the wind picked up. Inside the tent, Mallory and Irvine had left spare clothing, food, sleeping bags, oxygen cylinders, and parts of an oxygen apparatus. Outside, Odell found more parts of an oxygen apparatus, as well as a few cylinder carriers. Odell moved up the mountain a ways to help the pair if they were descending. He would yell and try to give them a reference point so they would know which direction to walk. The snow was still coming down and visibility was down to a few feet. By 4 p.m., Odell had to retreat to the tent. In 30 minutes, the weather cleared and Odell once more tried spotting his companions. He searched the face of Everest with his camera and binoculars. He could find no sign of the two men. Odell began the long walk back to Camp 4. June 9th, Odell and Hazard thoroughly inspected Camp 5 and 6 using binoculars with no sign of either mountaineer. Odell and two porters left Camp 6, and at 3:30 p.m. they reached Camp 5 where they spent the night. The following morning, he sent the porters back down to Camp 4, and then he went back up to Camp 6 on his own. Odell climbed alone to Camp 6, which he reached by 11 a.m. It was immediately apparent that Mallory and Irvine had not returned. Everything was as he had left it the day before. After trudging for 2 hours with no sign of either man, he figured they were probably Kaputski. Odell returned to Camp 6 and hauled two sleeping bags up to a snow patch, where he positioned them in the shape of a T, which communicated to the folks down below bad things had happened. Hazard, 3,700 feet below at Camp 4, saw the T-shaped signal, and he knew what it meant. He placed 6 blankets in the shape of a cross on the snow, relaying a signal of death to the watchers at Camp 3. The same day Mallory and Irvine were last seen alive, Mallory's wife, Ruth, and their children were on holiday in Beckton, Norway. Howard Somervall and Bentley Betham oversaw the carving and building of a memorial cairn at base camp in memory of all those who had perished in the 1921, 22, and 24 expeditions. How many people do they have to kill trying to get to the top of the world? May 30th, 1933. During another British Mount Everest expedition, Percy Wynne Harris and Lawrence Wager began their summit attempt from Camp 6 at 27,490 feet on the Yellow Band, below the Northeast Ridge. After approximately an hour of climbing, Wynne Harris found an ice axe located 60 feet below the crest of the Northeast Ridge, about 750 feet east of the first step. Wynne Harris and Wager left the axe where they had found it, but when they were returning back down from the mountain, Wynne Harris took the axe, leaving his own in its place. The axe was ascertained to either belong to Mallory or Irvine, to the exclusion of anyone else. No other mountaineers from the previous expeditions other than Mallory and Irvine were in the location where the axe was found. Although it is definitive the axe found was Mallory's or Irvine's, there's no evidence to prove which man was carrying it. 1977. Walt Unsworth, author of Everest, The Ultimate Book of the Ultimate Mountain, examined the axe discovered in 1933, and he found marks that nobody could identify as belonging to anyone. Walt went on to say, "Since my research for the two Oxford Fellows, I feel convinced that it marks the scene of an accident to Mallory and Irvine. I was scanning the face from the base camp through a high-powered telescope last year when I saw something in a gully below the scree shelf, and I do not believe it was a rock. The object was at precisely the point where Mallory or Irvine would have fallen had they rolled on over the scree slope below the yellow band. I think it is highly probable that we shall find further evidence next year." 1937, Frank Smythe wrote to Edward Norton in reply to Norton's book Camp 6. In his letter, Smythe said he felt certain he had seen where Mallory, or maybe Irvine, was laying. Smythe disclosed during 1936 British Mount Everest expedition he had scanned Everest's north face with a high-powered telescope from base camp and spotted an object which he presumed was the body of either Mallory or Irvine. He didn't want to write about this because the press would have had a field day with the information. Smythe's sighting was unknown to the public until his son Tony revealed the information in the 2013 book, My Father Frank, Unresting Spirit of Everest. Everest historian Tom Holzell, the co-author with Audrey Salkid of The Mystery of Mallory and Irvine, first became interested in Mallory and Irvine enigma after reading about it in the 1970 edition of The New Yorker. Holzell devised a theory regarding the mystery, which he published in 1971 edition of Mountain Magazine. His theory goes that the two mountaineers split up soon after Odell had sighted them ascending the second step. The pair had only enough oxygen for about 90 minutes. This would make the summit unattainable. If, on the other hand, one was to stay put while the other continued climbing, he would have enough O2 to make it to the top and back. Mallory was the one to continue on, while Irvine waited back down at the bottom of the first step. As Mallory was struggling on, Irvine beat feet back to Camp 6 to wait in the tent. As Irvine was making his way to the camp, that snowstorm caught him, making his visibility down to a few feet. In a whiteout, Irvine simply stepped off the side of a cliff. Holzell added that Mallory reached the summit in the late afternoon. Pulled out his camera, Mallory took a few photos, maybe one or two selfies, and then turned for camp. At some point, he slipped and fell, tumbling past the area where the ice axe had been found. Have you ever heard of the Rainbow Valley? It's not what most people think. Rainbow Valley gets its name from the multicolored jackets of all the casualties who have lost their lives on the mountain. All the colors of the rainbow. Many of the casualties had fallen inside the death zone. If they passed away on the mountain trail, other climbers would have been forced to push their bodies off the track and down into the valley below. 1980, Hotzel received a letter from Heree Suzuki, Foreign Secretary of the Japanese Alpine Club. Suzuki said, during a combined Japanese-Chinese expedition in 1979, one of the Chinese climbers named Hong Bao said he had been to Everest in 1975, when he had found two bodies along the trails. The witness kept saying these were Englishmen. He had gotten a good look at both bodies and had even touched them. The next day, after telling about the two dead Englishmen, Hong Bao was hurled off a cliff during an avalanche, supposedly. August 25, 1986, the Everest North Face Research Expedition gathered at the North Base Camp. The expedition was there not to climb to the top of the world, but to find out what became of Mallory and Irvine. The primary objective was to ascend to 27,000-foot terrace, where they intended to locate the remains of the English dead that Hong Bao had sighted during the 1975 Chinese expedition. They hoped if they could find Mallory or Irvine, they would also find the cameras that both mountaineers had been carrying. Their secondary objective was to search the area immediately above the second step, where they hoped to discover Mallory or Irvine's equipment, proving that they had reached this elevation and thus possibly had summited the mountain. The expedition established Camp 5 on the North Ridge at the elevation of 25,500 feet, but they were hampered by snowstorms and avalanches. They were unable to reach 27,500 feet where they had planned to establish Camp 6, from which they intended to search for Mallory and Irvine. Despite being unable to find the bodies, they did discover some of the equipment from the 22 expedition. Once back at Camp 4, they were informed by one of the climbers, who was on the Chinese-Japanese climb, that Hangboa was either mistaken or lying. The Chinese climber said he was there the whole time and nobody found any bodies. The goal of the 1999 Mallory Irvine research expedition was to discover whether Mallory and Irvine had been to the summit, had been able to be the first to summit Everest. Objectives included finding Irvine's body, retrieving any cameras that might hold proof of this summit success. The expedition was organized by Eric Simpson and Joachim Hemleb, with mountaineers Conrad Anker and cameraman Dave Hahn, and a bunch of other folks. After he had re-examined the historical records of the Everest North Face expedition, Joachim Hemleb went with the information from Hangboa about where the bodies might be found. Hangboa said he had discovered a body he had insisted was English during a 20-minute walk from their Camp 6. The initial challenge was to figure out where Chinese Camp 6 had been and then make a 20-minute circuit from that point. May 1st, 1999, at approximately 10 a.m., Anker, Hahn, Norton, Poles, and Richards reached 26,900 feet, where they established their Camp 6. From there, they set out and traversed west over the North Face. Anker decided to search on intuition and descended to a lower part of the snow terrace, where it dropped away 6,560 feet. After a search of the area, he discovered a body that was partially frozen into the scree, but it was well preserved due to the cold, dry air. Tied to the corpse's waist was the remains of a braided cotton climbing rope. Nobody uses cotton anymore, it's all nylon. Tangled around the body from which it was broken, frayed and trailed. Norton found a label inside the body's clothing that said G. Mallory. The expedition members were astonished to realize they hadn't found Irvine, they had found Mallory. They had some difficulty searching the body due to it being frozen like a rock. They did find a few possessions that did belong to Mallory, but they didn't find any camera. Experts from Kodak said it might be possible to develop images from the film. They had drawn up specific guidelines for an expedition that might find a camera. Mallory was left where he was found. The men used rocks to cover his remains. Mallory's daughter said that Mallory always carried a photo of his wife that he intended to leave at the summit. Since they didn't find the photo on the body, they are assuming he was on his way back down. Secondly, Mallory's snow goggles were in his pocket. This indicated that he was probably coming down at night. He and Irvine had made a push for the summit, and they were descending very late in the day. Given their known departure time and movements, had they not made the summit, it is unlikely that they would have been moving around after nightfall. Sir Edmond Hillery welcomed the discovery of Mallory's body, and he described it as very appropriate that Mallory may have summited decades earlier. Hillery said, "He was really the initial pioneer of the whole idea of climbing Mount Everest." Never mind that he didn't want to go in the first place. Mallory's son John said, "To me, the only way you achieve a summit is to come back alive. The job was only half done if you don't get back down." 2001, Mallory and Irvine research expedition retraced Mallory and Irvine's route and attempted to find artifacts from the earlier attempts. Jake Norton and Brent Okita discovered the remains of the 1924 Camp 6 from which Mallory and Irvine had departed on June 8th. Norton discovered a wool mitten of unknown origin. Nobody wears wool anymore. It's all these fancy new kinds of clothing that keep you a lot warmer and drier. There were searches for the pair in 2004, 2007, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2018, and 2019. If Mallory and Irvine did make it to the summit before dying on the mountain, not only would they be the first people to reach the top, they would have done it by way of the north face, which 40 years before the Chinese climbers accomplished it in 1960. 2019 author and climber Mark Synott visited the spot on the north face of Everest where Mallory's body had been found, hoping to locate the camera. He also wanted to locate Irvine's body and hopefully his camera as well. Despite using advanced drones to aid him in his search, Irvine and the cameras were never located. Now the plot sickens. Once back from his climb, Sonnet began hearing stories from the locals. People were saying that the Chinese had mounted an expedition sometime after Mallory had been found. The purpose was to find and get rid of Irvine and any evidence that anyone had summited by way of the North Face. Synott said, I kept hearing rumors that explained why I couldn't find Irvine. The Chinese had found his body and the camera long ago and then got rid of both. An official with the Chinese Tibetan Mountaineering Association told a Nepali friend of mine in the fall of 2019 these rumors were true. The camera had been kept under lock and key with other Mallory and Irvine artifacts in a museum in China. Synott alleges that the Chinese wanted to keep the success of Mallory and Irvine's climb a secret so that the Chinese team was able to take credit for the first successful climb using the North Face. We now have multiple sources, all essentially saying the same thing. The Chinese found Irvine, removed the body, and are jealously guarding this information from the rest of the world, all to protect the claim that the 1960 Chinese team was the first to reach the summit, he wrote. Mallory and Irvine were last seen by their climbing teammate, Noel Odell, just 800 feet from the summit. This was the last sighting of them, and what happened after remains a mystery. Synott's book was published April 2021, and a month later, he received an email from a former United States Marine officer, Wayne Wilcox, who was married to a British diplomat. Wilcox told Synott in a high-ranking official in the British Embassy had been told that the Chinese found the remains of a foreign climber at 26,902 feet during their 1975 expedition to the north face of Mount Everest. They recovered the lost Kodak and brought it back with them to Beijing. He went on to say they screwed up the development of the film, ruining it. Rather than admitting that they had made a mistake, they erased all evidence that they had found the camera or the body. Tibetan climber Pandu who was the first female climber to summit Mount Everest using the North Face, had told him in 1984 that the 1975 Chinese expedition had found the body of Irvine and the camera. The Chinese team brought home the cadaver and they attempted to develop the film but were unable to recover any images. Does it really matter who was the first? Well, yes, it does. Anyone who is willing to die for their goals should get credit for it. Even Edmond Hillery is willing to concede that maybe Mallory and Irvine got there first. National pride is great as long as you have something to be proud of. Just because history changes, that's how history is. And yet a lot of people, once they take credit for something, they don't want to let go. Hope you enjoyed this confusing and long-winded story about George Mallory. I almost said George Hillary. George Mallory, who may or may not have been the first man on top of the world. If you did like it, tell other people maybe they should be listening too. If you didn't like it, why are you still listening? If you have a story you'd like to see in print, send it to me. I would love to put you in my next book. Anything about UFOs, Bigfoot, chupacabras, ghosts, or just really crazy stories that your weird uncle tells you at Thanksgiving dinner, as long as the stories are true. Send them to me at strangethings@arkanasa.com and I'll put you in writing. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where there strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.